My name's Lizzie from Zuleika Gallery, and I'm here to welcome today the most amazing Julia Engelhardt, who's an artist that we're working with today. And we have also joining us Camilla Bonelli from the gallery. And Julia is currently exhibiting with us at the Stables Cafe, which is open until the end of April. Now, Julia is joining us from her studio, which is a nice I was going to say it's a nice bright corner of your living room where you have your loom. I've been there and it's a lovely corner. Julia's background is in arts publishing and in exhibitions, and she worked at the Hayward Gallery, the Design Museum, and with the V&A and Viking Penguin. And her work involved a lot of visual research and curation, and as such she has the most amazing visual memory. Colours, textures, proportions, visions, sensations, all of which get distilled and fed into her woven pieces. Julia now lives and works in Oxford, and I came across her through a group exhibition last year. And actually before that, when we had our online exhibition for charity, wasn't it, Julia? You submitted virtually, but then I saw it in person after COVID, that was it. So I was aware of your work. And I was simply thrilled to see Julia's work. It's our first foray into weaving as a media here at the gallery, which is ridiculous considering I was reading that the media itself really has its first origins around 7000 BC with the Chinese weaving bamboo, and then woven silk at the earliest dates to 2700 BC. So I feel like I'm very late to the party. And Julia, I'm sure, can tell us much more about the history, as I know she knows a lot more about it. And we do have a PowerPoint with images. So I think what we'll do now is we'll share the PowerPoint, and thank you in advance to Julia for sharing all her knowledge too about her work. So let me get the PowerPoint up. The Zuleika Gallery is in Woodstock, and what's wonderful about Blenheim is it's just down the road. So if you want to come and see the exhibition, do pop into the gallery. And here we have Julia. Now, Julia, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your background before you came to the loom, as it were.
Textiles were very much part of my childhood in many ways. I started making things very early on. We had quite topical, we had refugees staying in one of the cottages nearby, and one of them was a seamstress, so I watched her and saw, you know, the delight in fabrics and what she could make, and you know, it was fantastic. So I liked making things like that. I was very, very good at any kind of needlework and that sort of thing, and did quite a lot of drawing as well. So that it was always, I always had that sort of outlet from childhood alongside any academic work, which I was also okay at, you know, and I was quite good at maths, which helped later on with the weaving.
How mathematical is weaving, Julia, out of interest?
There's quite a lot of calculations and understanding the constructions, because you know, threading a loom can get quite complex depending on how skilled you get, because you have what's called heddles, and they are attached to shafts, and depending on how you thread these heddles, different patterns emerge as you, or are possible as you lift the shafts. And so you can have looms, hand looms up to 24 shafts, or very few people have those. I mean, 8 is the norm and 16 is very good. And but it gets quite complex by the time you have to hand manipulate, you know, 8 shafts. So in that sense, you have to know what you're doing, how to achieve patterns, and you know, and so in that sense, it's quite mathematical. It is also, in many ways, fabrics are constructed so they can have different layers. So there's something called double cloth, or something called lampas, which I use occasionally, which basically has two two layers, and then it has another layer on top which holds the whole fabric together. So you have to understand those things. So that's all quite logical, if you see what I mean.
Logical if you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
I was wondering also, I know you went on a short course with Margot Selby, and you can perhaps tell us more about that. But I wondered when the first time was that you came across a loom, whether that was in childhood, and so the seed was kind of placed at that point, and what it was that attracted you to weaving. Was it because it feels like you're using the technique in a really free way, in a very painterly way, which is perhaps what I love about the way you are engaging with the medium. And I just wondered whether that was always the thought with it, because it's quite experimental. It'd just be interesting to know, what your first kind of interactions were.
My parents went to the States when I was a child, and they brought me back a weaving from Santa Fe, a chimayo weaving, which is a technique that from descendants of the Spaniards down in Texas. And they're very geometrical, these, and they are very graphic and geometrical, very simple weavings. They're, just in the most simple techniques, except for the way they use the color and these shapes. And I can remember the colors of it. I can almost remember the shapes on it. That's how I've, in later life, identified it's chimayo, because I was just intrigued. And they bought me a loom after this, because I was so intrigued by it. They bought me a little loom, a very simple loom, where you could only do plain weave, nothing else. There were no shafts or anything. So basically what a lot of people all over the world started out with weaving on, which is plain weave, and anything fanciful you had to do by hand if you wanted to do to have a pattern or something like that. So that was my first encounter with weaving, and I've it developed, I suspect, a different sort of sensibility for fabrics. I mean, I loved sewing things in my teenagehood. It was a very, and it was a great thing to actually go into a shop and see the riches of different fabrics and how they were made and how they were woven or printed or whatever. It was it was a real delight.
Wonderful. So it sounds like there's a real passion the seed was placed in childhood and then it stayed with you, and there's this sense of color and structure which you just love about textures. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about your course with Margot Selby.
Well, this was in 2013, and I was sort of we had moved to Oxford by this point, and I was only working part-time, and I was eyeing something to do, some point creative to do. I mean, my career was creative in many ways, but not in a practical way. So I was trying to go back into, I always thought I would paint, but then I started a textiles degree course and got quite frustrated with it, although I did well at it. So then I went on this short course with Margot Selby in 2013, and she had 8 looms like the one on the left set up in her studio, all with different warp setups. So you could try, course participant could try to weave with different patterns, and they had a full run of all her stash, any yarns, beautiful yarns. And so I came away with 3 samples, which were very nice. 2 of them were very nice. The third one was a bit messy. And I thought, I want to give this a try, because this was very, it was quite a challenge, because I knew I could weave. In the end, I could weave, but I didn't have a clue how to set up a loom, how to dress a loom, so I had to teach myself. And I thought, that's just what I need at this juncture in my life. I mean, in a positive way. So I taught myself over time, and clearly successfully, but teaching myself in that way gave me also a lot of freedom, because somebody recently recommended I look at the work of Monica Correa, who was a weaver who was married to Charles Correa, who's an well-known Indian architect. And she said she was really happy that she never had any formal training, because it allowed her to do things in a much more relaxed and free spirited way than if she had had formal training. Because in many ways, weaving is traditional weaving is extremely disciplined and extremely you need a lot of concentration and patience. And if you know, there are certain things you stop worrying about, you can be much freer, obviously. And that is what I am doing. I'm basically...
Well, it's wonderful. I think one of the ways that you show your freedom and your freeness is the loose ends. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but they seem to be a sort of metaphor for the freedom that you feel.
Well, I think they add life in some ways, because I mean, this is all, traditional weaving is quite rigid and patterns can be quite rigid, and I want to all, you know, loosen it up, free it up, sort of make it more alive. So I'm always interested in techniques that make things feel more alive. And I think it's nice for people to see what the materials are. I could also not weave quite a lot of the pieces that I have woven over time if I had to worry about tidying the ends away, because they would just look messy on the edges. You know, there's too many different threads used and all that. Yeah, I mean, I think also I use quite a lot of different materials in every piece. So I think it's interesting to see what these materials are. You know, and not to hide away the ends. It's all quite, I mean, some people these days talk about a trend towards honest weaving, and I suspect in some ways that's what it is. You can see what's there and what it would look like if you didn't try to hide bits, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. No, I think it's really lovely, and I guess that's it. It is. I like the concept of honest weaving and not hiding, you know, where it's from, and being able to admire the beauty of the actual threads that make up the whole. In a way, it's a bit like the sort of Japanese kintsugi technique, isn't it? Where, you know, things don't have to be perfect, and it's the way you make things beautiful. Not that there's anything that's broken here, but it's more the fact that there's a joy in the actual substance itself and in the threads themselves, as well as in the overall whole that is produced. So perhaps you talked a little bit about Monica Correa and not having any formal training. Now, one of the other influences in your work is Sheila Hicks. And I know that she's had quite an impact. I wonder if we should look at the next slide and talk about her a little.
Yes, well, Sheila Hicks comes from Nebraska. She is now 88 years old, and I think her career really took off over the last 20 years. I first encountered her work in 2014 in the form of something called minim, which immediately caught my attention. Sheila Hicks lives in Paris most of the time, I believe, when she's not traveling, which she still does quite a lot. And minim means small pieces, or not minimalist pieces, but small pieces. So these are small pieces, as you can see illustrated here, small pieces that she has produced on a very, very, very basic loom, and is still producing on a very basic little loom, as a kind of, as sketches, as little works of art in their own right. otherwise she now does really quite monumental works. She has an exhibition coming to Hepworth, and there'll be huge pieces, you know, architectural pieces, sculptural pieces, but she still carries on with very separately with these small, very small miniature pieces that contain little worlds, that contain a narrative. She said, and sometimes at some point she said they're like letters. And when she would travel, she would weave her impressions into these little pieces. And I found them a great inspiration, because they're just simply made, but with complete artistic freedom. And they record what she feels or what she wants to say. They have lovely, often quite witty titles. Sometimes they're serious titles, like this one. This is depicts a scene where she lived on an island off the west coast of Brittany, a very wild island for some time. And this is the lighthouse on that island, on a very barren island. And she describes how the lights would, what's the word, return into her bedroom at regular intervals, the light from the lighthouse. And since I have great affinity to Western Brittany and the wildness of it and the relative desertedness, this piece speaks to me particularly. But there are many of different parts of the world, very colorful, and her work really enthuses me, I have to say. It kind of opened a way for me to be able to find a way to express what I wanted to express or want to express. Now, the little loom that she uses is actually, the first one of that type was just made of stretcher bars, which she had put into a square, and little nails on each side, on two sides, and she would have her warp around those nails, and then she would sew between. And so basically her warp becomes the canvas, which I think is a very nice image for what she does and what I do as well. I treat the warp as the canvas.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that, and it certainly is. Obviously, it's a weaving, it's a textile, but it's very reminiscent of some of the work of some of the minimal artists that we work with here in the gallery, and I think it's a beautiful piece, and I love the idea of it being her world in a small way. It reminded me of an exhibition we had last year with Trevor Sutton called Small World, where he made really small minimal pieces, and I was thinking how they sort of seem to have a synchronicity. What's also lovely about, well, I think this is something I love in art in general, but looking at this particular Hicks that you've picked out here, is I love the kind of the lack of symmetry and the way it's controlled, and but yet it's not regimental. Yeah. I think that's what's really lovely about it. There's a real sort of passion that comes through. So another one of your influences, as I know, is Paul Klee. And I just wondered, I know he's been a huge influence, and I wondered if we could perhaps talk about him. I love the pairing here with Cloth of Splendor. It's a beautiful pairing.
Well, the interesting thing about this particular pairing is that I had an exhibition in Summertown last year, part of Art Weeks, and a lady came into the shop and bought the piece, my piece on the right, because it reminded her of the piece on the left from which she had an art print that she bought at Art Basel decades ago, and she said she couldn't believe the affinity between the two. And I couldn't believe that anybody could walk off the street and tell me there's an affinity between your work and Paul Klee's. You know, it just left me left me
That's
quite
extraordinary.
happy, actually.
Well,
Very
I
happy.
think it must have been really affirming.
Yeah.
I think moments like that, when somebody else gets it and gets what you're trying to do, you know, makes everything feel worth doing.
Yes, but clay has been around since my childhood, really. My mother quite liked him too, and or she liked him first, I dare say. And but to even certain elements even speak to children. And then when I grew a bit older, I was absolutely fascinated by his color studies, his chromatics color studies, and absolutely beautiful. There's you know, the nuance of color he managed to create just with his watercolors, and you know, and just
I hadn't appreciated myself that he taught weaving at the Bauhaus.
he didn't talk weaving, he taught the weaving workshop in kind of I suspect aesthetics. He had an affinity to
Okay.
pattern. He had an
Right.
affinity to pattern, and throughout his life he would very occasionally do pieces that were sort of, I think, ideas for rugs almost, and some of his pieces have been made into rugs, in fact. But so the carpet and the textile was at the back of his mind, but I think it was more the aesthetics and the colors and, you know, design and that sort of thing that he taught. I don't think he would have done anything.
Well, thank you for clarifying, because I was thinking I didn't
Not a
realize
weaver.
that.
He was not a weaver.
That's what I was thinking. I
He
hadn't
was
realized
a
that.
highly gifted musician. He was also apparently a highly gifted violinist. So
Right.
that it was his second sort of thing. But I mean, I don't think, I don't know whether he's ever woven anything. I'm not aware of
No,
it.
it's just that I read that in the notes that he had taught weaving, so I was confused, but he taught, it makes more sense if you, as you say, thinking about pattern and color, and in that context that would make a very interesting kind of mentorship, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So that definitely makes sense. And let's move on to the next one. So here we have a couple of works in the exhibition, and again, I love your titles. Perhaps you picked this up from Sheila Hicks, but Spidery Weave and String of Shells are obviously very enigmatic and immediately sort of bring to mind, you know, a subject matter. Perhaps you can tell us a bit more about that. You know, whether is it something that you're conscious of as you're weaving, or does it come together once the kind of shape emerges, what you feel like it's about? It'd be interesting to know.
No, it emerges once I'm at it, as it were. It's something I've always admired in clay. One, the juxtaposition of image and words. I find his words add something to the work. They're not just descriptive, they often add something, and similarly with Sheila Hicks. And so I like that idea, so I had that at the back of my mind, and I'm trying to do the same things. I mean, there is a suggestion with certain warps that I will do something sea related, for example, or wind related or something. There's some bluey, but a lot of my warps are actually very neutral. So it's more like I'm almost playing where I can pull it to in terms of coloring and texturing and textures, and because I don't want, the warp is quite long, between at least 4 meters, sometimes 6. And you know, you don't want to weave the same piece over and over again. It also means that sometimes you get stuck because you've got this warp left, you don't want to throw it away, but you really cannot make any more work on it. So any other piece, so you just leave it to one side and go to your other loom, or things like that. Anyway.
So what techniques have you used here, Julia?
This technique is something called honeycomb or waffle weave. The setup is quite simple. The threading and basically, it's, if used with the right sort of material, it gives immense potential for sculptural weaving. And so these pieces are woven on an Indian silk, which has got a slight, very, very thin viscose coating on it, and it makes it quite stiff and crinkly, and you know, it wants to do its own thing, but if you combine it with the right materials, you get beautiful three-dimensional effects with this. And you know, you can make it move. You can make the whole piece move, like the string of shell. I mean, I think they both move to my eye anyway. Might be patterned, but they move.
They're simply gorgeous. I think there's a beautiful kind of control of the gradation of tones and shape, and yeah, I think String of Shells definitely has that sense of movement as well in particular, but I love the kind of balance of color and textures in the spidery weave. I was also wondering, you spoke about your materials a little bit and sort of responding to how they are and how they kind of have an effect on the overall image. I wondered if you you know, I imagine you're very particular in where you source your materials from. You know, do you? I mean, you don't need to tell me where you source them from, but you know, do you find yourself looking for, you know, for particular materials and going to great lengths to get the right thing?
Well, no sources. I try to use with fantastic different materials, and I almost sometimes get inspired by the materials, like this Indian silk or other things, other materials. But basically, because I don't have a plan, I put a few things together, but often to when I start, but often pieces go another way from what I initially think I might do that day or the following day or whatever. I mean, I don't stand by my pieces. I don't, what's the word? I don't,
they pre-plan, they evolve.
no, they're not pre-planned,
Yeah.
they evolve. And so
Yeah.
that means, you know, sometimes I will plan for some color and I need more of this, or I need some in this color, a selection of this, or something like that. But otherwise, I don't go out of my way to find things these days, because I think I have done fairly thorough research of what's available.
So do you tend to start with the kind of the materials you've got to hand and sort of take your inspiration from what you've got and then go from there, and that's how it evolves?
Yeah, a great deal. And what I see online, I mean, recently I've had problems with using wool. I only use it very sparingly for some reason. And I think it's partly because it can easily look very utilitarian. You know, like, why isn't this a scarf kind of thing? Why don't you? So I bought that because I want to tackle wool. I think it might work. So I have bought some very nice alpaca, baby alpaca, which I think I can make into possibly a series of small pieces that will be very attractive.
Interesting. I look forward to seeing those. We're just moving on to the next one. This is one of your lockdown works, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was very much. It was a beautiful spring, if people remember. It was fantastic weather for weeks on end, and we were on our daily little walks, and there were, you know, the meadows were full of buttercups, and, you know, I love this sort of fat yellow and dark green anyway, so I wove that. And then the black wall is, you know, that's the symbol of the limitation and death and all that. So
And what's the technique here? Because it's much more sort of, you know, it's definitely not waffle weave, I might say, or am I wrong there?
it is.
Oh, it is waffle weave.
It is waffle weave.
Is this the waffle weave here?
Yeah, in the middle. But I mean, I take all sorts of liberties with it. I don't do the whole, you know, I take a lot of liberties with it.
I love these really bold stretches of fabric, you know, that you've woven through here. These are silk.
Yeah.
Yeah, really beautiful. And it's almost like a massive, it's like a painter getting a big blob on their paintbrush, isn't it? And
yeah,
swishing it across.
yeah.
It's really bold.
Yes, it would be nice to use more fabric, but I find it slightly tricky at the moment. So to find the right sort of fabrics, and they can also they can look very brash, but I think in this case it works very well.
Well, I think all of your
Especially those colours.
Colours are glorious, and it does, when you say it's, do you remember the sunshine of that first lockdown? It does bring back the sort of, if there was a positive side, the positive side of it all, of when we were able to go out and enjoy nature.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next one. So this is Autumn Weave, so the same year.
No, it's before.
Is this before? Okay, I was just looking. Yeah, so this is before, but this is using Peruvian techniques. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And that I was attracted to because it said you could get flickering effects. And I don't think this piece is the best to show the flickering effect, but I think it is. I really love this piece. I think it is very autumnal to me, looks to me, and yeah, I mean, that autumn there was serious illness in the family, and I sort of took out my loom to the garden and sort of wove along, and the pieces are all quite dark, but I mean, there's this series, and then there's the other series which is following on, which were done at this time, which were very basic things like seasons and November and autumn, and sorry?
What made you want to do it outside? It must have been freezing. Just thinking, weaving.
No, it wasn't that cold. It was quite warm.
Yeah.
It was quite warm, and it was just to get the air and to get it just felt different. I mean, I've not had taken the loom outside since. It was just something I somehow needed to do.
Yeah.
And it was warm until I think mid-November. It was, I mean, I started out September, October, November. So
we could call this plein air weaving.
I could call it plein air weaving, yes. There's also the light question. There's the light question. I mean, I do need daylight. And as the days go shorter, there's obviously a bit more light outside, a bit more daylight outside. But I mean, I've tried weaving by lamplight, but I always undo it the next day because I don't like the colors together or something. So I've gave up 4 or 5 years ago to try and weave by lamplight. So I've now sought out the brightest corners in the house to weave, basically, which is the 2 places that you saw. You have pictures of.
We do. And so here we have, talking about the light, the November sun, which is very powerful. And again, here, what's interesting is the way you've let the air come in. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yes. Well, it's a technique that is very prosaically called cramming and spacing, and you can cram or space in any way you like. And so it could be more irregular, but it was the first time I actually used this technique, and I can see actually a lot of potential in it, particularly since you can use it with monofilament, very thin nylon, which is practically invisible, or also they're very fine stainless steel yarns. So I think you could, combined with these ribbons and things, I think one could do quite fantastical creations.
Extraordinary to hear about stainless steel yarn. I think that sounds incredible.
Well, it's suddenly you can shape your piece. I've done some recently, it becomes faintly stiff. So you can make forms, you can bend it. Whereas monofilament is the exact opposite. Monofilament doesn't like to be, it just does whatever it likes, but pretty much. But
so you've got both of those in this work, monofilament?
No steel in this work. No, I'm not sure there's any steel in any of the pieces in this exhibition.
Monofilament. Okay, in this one. Okay. Well, I'd love to still see a steel work. That sounds really interesting. I was also interested in reading about your childhood memories of not watching television, and how that inspired you, and I guess has given you a good sense of colour. Talking about watching ants, something as simple as that. Perhaps you can expand.
Yeah, well, I mean, most people didn't have television when I was a child, and my parents were very anti anyway, so they bought one after I left home. But when I was little, I mean, we lived in the countryside, and you could go into the woods across the street, and there were these red ants who built ant heaps. And it's just fascinating to watch. I mean, you know, when you don't have zillions of toys, and you don't have a television, or you don't have a phone, or you don't have an iPad or anything like that, you know, you have to find your own entertainment, and ants can be fascinating. I tell you, the way they sort of build up a whole big heap out of needles, pine needles. You know, you wonder why the whole thing doesn't just collapse, but it doesn't. It doesn't. They run in and out, and you know, bring more bits of pine, and it's just fascinating.
Well, perhaps if we all didn't have televisions, there'd be many more amazing weavers around, I think. That would be a good thing. And this one I was interested, is called Textures of Granada. Is that sort of thinking about the Alhambra, or is it the city?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's the Alhambra and the Philly, the carvings and the lettering and the colouring and the calmness and quietness, apart from the tourist, obviously. But I mean, there are certain interiors that were just quite quiet, and you know, so it's
and it's quite geometric as well, like some of the designs.
Well, this is one of my few warps where I actually had stripes, which wasn't that neutral, as you can see. You know, even one quite strong coloured stripe, a black stripe. So it obviously looks a lot more structured, because it's got a pattern in the warp, not just in the weft.
Yes. So that was 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And then we come on to another great influence. When was it that we had the Annie Albers exhibition?
2018.
Right. So that was
very refreshing to see that exhibition, because there was when she was the first woman weaver who ever had an exhibition in an art museum in I think at MoMA, or was it the Met, in 1949. And so she's a bit of a very great pioneer, actually, in that sense. And she tried to do she did you know, pan arts that were meant as works of art rather than just sort of, but she also did very interesting experiments with different techniques. And I have to start experimenting with some of the other things that were in the exhibition, but she used this particular technique that is depicted here that I picked up. And
this is the twisting technique that we've got.
The twisted technique, yeah, it's hand manipulated lino. So this is the technique where I actually have to interfere with a warp beyond the normal shuttle movement from left to right with a weft. So yeah, and I thought she did beautiful pieces with this technique, but they are all very tightly tensioned around mounts. And I thought, if you don't tension them, there's fantastic potential for fluidity in this technique. So that's what I've really used it for, to make fluid looking pieces, and you know, it gives threads to
there's a lot of movement in all your work, really, Julia. It feels like a natural kind of development to be experimenting in this way, and there is a definite fluidity. to my eye, and there's a sort of calmness, and there's an underlying rhythm, and I guess a sort of sense of order, but it almost feels like they're in the breeze in a nice way. There's a nice natural feeling.
Yes, thank you. That's yeah, I mean, I'm aiming for movement.
Yeah.
It's basically, you have this very square, rigid piece of machinery with very tight, incredibly tight warps. The tighter the better, almost, because then you don't get too much unevenness in the weft. And you wanted the piece to come out of that as something organic.
Yes.
Clay had lots of ideas about the instability of the line. He liked that, set that against the geometry of some of his works, pictures he where he had lines, but often sometimes they were drawn with a ruler, but often they were done by hand. And I think he believed in the instability of the line, and he said
that concept.
drawing.
Yeah.
He had this great thing about taking a line for a walk. Drawing is taking a line for a walk, and I mean that's what if you look at these pieces here, where you have particularly in the middle piece, the middle red thing, that is just you take a line for a walk. To me anyway. You just let it happen. What happens to it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great concept. And I didn't realize when I said breeze that this is the name of your next piece, Fresh Breeze.
Yes.
Which is it's a quite different feeling when we don't have the threads at the edges. This is much more, although there's a kind of the movement within it, it feels much more tight and contained. What made you sort of make it in this way as opposed to with the threads? Was a particular impetus behind it?
Well, I learned this technique from Margot Selby at another short course, and she has made an absolute art out of it. It is very fine work. It has a lot of warp threads. I mean, it's quite labor intensive. I think this has a sort of calmness that doesn't really need the loose ends in the end.
Yeah.
I mean, on this particular warp, I did make 2 pieces, which both sold. So I don't have them anymore. But where I did leave the ends loose, but they were quite different from this in character. And I quite like to occasionally just, mount things, and just also for a contrast. I mean, I like exhibiting, and I think it's nice to have a variety of things. But I mean, I think it was very suitable to mount it like this, was very suited to this particular technique.
Absolutely. Well, it's just different, isn't it? So it's more contained, and then you've got the kind of the movement within. And I agree, it's more structured in a way, and it brings us a little bit. It reminds me sort of quite close to Sheila Hicks in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, the big faux pas in this are all these floats. A traditionally trained weaver would not have all these floats in this. Floats are the bits that are not woven in, that are sort of on top of the fabric, loosely on top of the fabric. And so, I mean, they are what makes this piece quite unique for the technique, because initially I accidentally ended up with some floats, and then when I tried this first, and then I thought it'd be rather nice. You could do a lot with these, it's sort of, especially with this very soft bamboo yarn. I mean, I think.
Again, I think it's a happy incidental. If it was too defined, it wouldn't be quite so satisfying. The fact is, there's this kind of movement, this organic nature to it, which is kind of the technique and the materials are all kind of coming together. And if it was too contained, it would kind of feel almost functional. And it's not functional. You know, that's the whole point. This is where textiles, you know, are coming into art. And I did note on your I think it was the comments for the exhibition somewhere that he said that painting used to be taught as a craft, you know, in the same way textiles
Yes,
being taught as a craft. And it's just, you know, this is emblematic of where I think you know, it's crossing over, you know, and it's a deliberate choice on your behalf to make it, you know, art for art's sake, which is what's so beautiful about it, and non-functioning, which is, you know, what we're enjoying so much. Another lovely juxtaposition here. I particularly like this one, A Very Tidy Mind. I have to say, there's something very satisfying about it. Can you tell us what this technique is? Again, it seems very structured, but also it's freeing because we've got the edges like this.
very strangely, the threading is exactly the same as for honeycomb, but this technique, because you lift the shafts in a different way and a different sequence, is called brocade.
Okay.
A very ancient brocade, I think, from around 1,000 years ago or something. And yes, and I enjoyed. I did that at the end of lockdown. I decided it was time to learn something new, so I learned about brocade, and I really like this technique. It just makes quite a nice change. It becomes slightly three-dimensional because I try to make the inlays, as it were, in this case the lines and the dots, I might try to make them quite substantial, so they actually like little blobs that come out rather than, you know, flat, being level with the basic weave. But yeah, I'm doing several. I've done several warps like this of late. I find it quite satisfying, and I think I've asked for this clay to be next to it partly because I wanted to show a piece that has these beautiful color gradations, but I also think that you know, a lot of the ideas or the features or whatever I have soaked up over the years. I don't copy, I don't imitate. I just sometimes I look at something after I've made something and I think, yeah, it has to do something with that. And I feel like this piece and the way the warp works here and everything with, you know, the mix of the red and the green and stuff, somehow subconsciously, I think this work, the clay work, feeds into my work without me knowing particularly. I mean, I'm not trying to emulate. It's not conscious. I'm not trying to emulate or equate or whatever. It's just I can see parallels suddenly.
So this particular work by clay, then, is it something that you've seen in the flesh, or is it something perhaps you've seen through your books or your work? Obviously, you worked for very many years, you know, in publishing, you know, so you've obviously got a really strong visual memory. What made you pick this particular one out? It's really interesting.
Well, I find it beautiful. I find it very beautiful. I had seen endless clays in books, endless clays in books over the years. And then when I did a lot of work for the Hayward Gallery, and when I had a round birthday, a friend treated me and a friend to a private session of an exhibition of clay's work they did at the time. So I'm pretty sure this work was in the exhibition. But the exhibition was absolutely magic because, again, he works in quite a small, like Sheila Hicks and myself now, works in quite small formats. The pieces hold against big walls, but they are small. I was very surprised how small they were. And
well, that sounds like it would have been the most incredible experience to be able to see, you know, a private view of an exhibition at the Hayward. No wonder that's going to really hold its place in your visual memory on a subconscious level. I imagine that's going to be a very strong influence.
Yeah.
That would make sense. Another two very recent works as well.
Yeah. Well, this is more brocade. Well, on the right it's brocade, but on the same you can actually do something that people would know as corduroy. So some of the piece on the left is corduroy on the same warp with a bit of brocade mixed in. And I mean, the subject matter is I have a great affinity to gardens. I love visiting gardens. I have a garden myself. We have a garden that I love and I sort of fiddle about in a lot. And and yeah, that's
Beautiful.
and yes, and I mean these two pieces are not in the exhibition at Blenheim. You had these two pieces in the shop and not in the shop, in the gallery, and they were integrated with some of your other artists, and I think they looked absolutely natural, absolutely at home. And to me, that was a very nice experience when I saw it.
Well, I'm
I
so
have
glad.
to say that is what I aim for. I would like my pieces to be part of the general, you know, part of the, what's the word?
The visual landscape, or the
visual landscape of what people have hanging on their walls.
Well, they're beautiful, and they I have to say, when they were much admired when we had them hanging in the gallery. I'm sure we will have them again. And I think I mentioned I saw a couple in a collector's I was going to say office, actually, not house, today, and you know, there for everybody to see, and they look amazing. And it's nice to see your work getting in airing in public spaces, not only at the Stables cafe, but I'm particularly pleased to see how we're able to show such a larger group at Blenheim, to display, you know, the incredible breadth of your work and the sensitivity of it. And I would urge everybody who can to go and see the work in person, because it really does benefit from close viewing and not just seeing on a screen. So thank you, Julia, so much. And we're so thrilled to be showing you in the gallery. And
okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.